Roberts with a six full-time staff. No, I'll do that.
So do I.
Okay, good evening, everyone. If we quiet down, just about ready to get started. Well, first off, welcome to the Adam Smith Institute. Welcome back if this is not your first time here. My name is Daniel Pryor. I am the head of research here. For those who aren't aware, we are a free market think tank. We've been around the late 70s, and our mission is to try to change government policy and public opinion through various outlets, including our media, events such as this one, our education programs, and of course, our research. And tonight we are very pleased indeed to welcome David Friedman to discuss common misrepresentations of Adam Smith, this institute's namesake, of course. And about an hour before we all turned up tonight, I was scrolling through the Adam Smith Institute's Twitter and got a response saying, I actually read Adam Smith. He believed in the labor theory of value and that landlords are all parasites. Adam Smith Institute is a terrible right-wing think tank. Sir, so what better time to hear from David why that might not quite be the case. David, of course, is an academic economist with a doctorate in physics, retired from 23 years teaching in a law school. His first book, The Machinery of Freedom, an absolutely excellent book, was published in 1973 and is now in its third edition. I'm credited with converting me away from natural rights libertarianism to consequentialist libertarianism, so thank you very much for that. Indeed. His most recent non-fiction book is Legal System Very Different from Ours, covering systems from Periclean Athens through modern Amish and Romany systems as well. And he's also the author of 3 novels. Is that right? 3? Excellent. 1 commercially published, 2 self-published, and it's an absolute pleasure to have him here tonight. So David, take it away and thank you.
Thank you. You also left out the medieval cookbook jointly written with my wife. Yeah, from time, I should say Adam Smith had, as best I can tell, 3 different labor theories of value. So that's a rather complicated issue. But from time to time, mostly online, I noticed people making claims about Adam Smith that aren't true. And I've been sort of collecting them. I've got a draft chapter for something I'm planning to eventually write. And I thought it would be fun, given that he's what this organization is named after, to give a talk discussing them. The first and, in a sense, oddest misrepresentation is the claim that he believed in progressive income taxes. And this is odd because not only did he not believe in progressive income taxes, he did not believe in income taxes at all. That's a slight exaggeration. He did concede that it might make sense to tax the income of government employees, but every other category of income he goes through one after another, he doesn't want to tax. Nonetheless, he does say, oops, this is not working. Sorry, we have a problem. For whatever reason, this is doing nothing. Sorry, we will take a very brief break while I disconnect this, which gets me back to hopefully my system, and see whether it then works. No, it still isn't working. All right, I know what I will do. Just a minute. I am going to stop using my presentation mode, which I don't really need for this purpose, and do an ordinary version of PowerPoint. And hopefully that will, yes, that one seems to work on my machine. So with luck, it will work on your machine. Tell me when we get back. There we are. Now let's see. This is what Smith actually says on the subject. The subjects of every state ought to contribute towards the support of the government as nearly as possible in proportion to their respective abilities, that is, in the proportion to the revenue which they respectively enjoy under the protection of the state. Now that looks like a flat tax, but notice that it is not calculated in terms of how much money who hands over, but in terms of tax burden. That one of the mistakes that almost everybody makes talking about taxes is to assume that you can determine who actually pays a tax by seeing who hands over the money. So to take the sort of standard economist example, suppose we have a tax on selling something, and then the money is handed over by the seller. Suppose we had an identical tax on buying that something, the effects would be identical. And yet in one case, the money is handed over by the seller and in one by the buyer. So in the US, our Social Security system is nominally funded half by employers and half by employees, and that's pure window dressing. How the burden is actually allocated is a more complicated question, but it doesn't depend on the formal version. Smith understood this, as most newspaper people today don't. So what he was trying to do as best he could with his very limited economic theory was figuring out who was actually poorer as a result of a tax, not who the money came from. And that comes up later. But in any case, I do not know how people get the idea that I guess they don't read. Well, I've seen at least one person who quoted this and thought it was evidence of a progressive tax. And maybe he was confusing a flat tax with it wasn't a flat tax, it's proportional to income. But a fair number of people assert it, even Murray Rothbard asserts it, though he gives no evidence. Next quote, which is one, it's related to this because there are a number of people who try to offer evidence that Smith wanted to redistribute from rich to poor. And the quote that I have seen was, it must always be remembered, however, that it is the luxuries and not the necessary expense of the inferior ranks of people that ought ever to be taxed. And that sort of can be read as the luxuries of the rich, though it doesn't say so. And in fact, the passage doesn't really say that at all. The passage this is coming from is, it must always be remembered, however, that it is the luxurious and not the necessary expense of the inferior ranks of people that ought ever to be taxed. What's going on is that Smith has a sort of a version of what's sometimes called the iron law of wages. And he believes that if you tax the subsistence of the workers, that will push up wages because the wages have to be high enough so the workers can reproduce their population. That's a basic an idea which you see in a number of the classical economists. Therefore, if you tax the necessities of the workers, that will actually be paid by other people because their wages will rise to. But if you tax the luxuries of the workers, that doesn't result in their being less able to reproduce themselves, and therefore the workers will pay. So this is in fact an argument for taxing luxuries of workers instead of necessities of workers. If you look at the version on the top, however, you will notice that they have changed luxurious to luxuries and added a comma after luxuries, and thus in fact changed the meaning of it. It is not clear where this comes from. There is a mid-19th century text of Wealth of Nations done with commentary by a French author whose name I forget, which has the incorrect text. And it was picked up by Project Gutenberg and is therefore something it's easy to find online. And it might be that people have seen that and then interpret it as they wanted to. Next quote is, the rich should contribute to the public expense, not only in proportion to their revenue, but something more than in that proportion, which does sound as though he's in favor of progressive tax if he had written that, but in fact he didn't. What he actually wrote was, it is not very unreasonable that the rich should contribute to the public expense, not only in proportion. What's going on is that he is arguing that a tax on houses is in some ways a desirable tax. However, a tax on houses falls more heavily on the rich than the poor. And he's saying that although that's an unfortunate fact, it is not so unfortunate that it should lead to your not considering that tax. So it is, people are converting, it is not, people are interpreting, it is not very unreasonable, that as if it was sort of a sarcastic way of saying it's a good thing, whereas Smith means what he says, it is not very unreasonable, it's a tolerable but not desirable feature. But you will notice that the quote I have on above, which is how I found it, not only has the person cut off the first 6, I think, words of the passage, he has capitalized that "the" from the middle of the sentence in order to pretend that that's how it starts. So that's one where somebody pretty clearly was engaged in fraud. Now, people who have, the people I saw it from may not have, they may have just copied it from someone who copied it from someone, but at some point somebody was deliberately lying. The next quote is one which again is used to imply that Smith was against the rich. Wherever there is great property, there is great inequality. For one very rich man, there must be at least 500 poor, and the affluence of the few supposes the indigence of the many. And that's a correct quote, but like a number of these, you have to look at the context, because he then goes on to say, the affluence of the rich excites the indignation of the poor, who are often both driven by want and prompted by envy to invade his possessions. It is only under the shelter of the civil magistrate that the owner of that valuable property, which is acquired by the labor of many years, or perhaps of many successive generations, can sleep a single night in security. So what Smith is actually talking about is why you need a government to protect property once you have substantial inequalities of wealth. He is not arguing against substantial inequalities, and in fact, the comment acquired by the labor of many years implies that he on the whole approves them, but you can't maintain them unless there is a civil magistrate, unless there's some sort of law enforcement. And that's the point that he makes. I should say that one, several of these actually, I picked up in a blog by somebody whose last name is Smith, oddly enough, and who had a whole bunch of these things. And basically, he was trying to claim that Smith was not a conservative, that conservatives were misappropriating, that he was really a progressive. Now, it is true that Smith is not a conservative. I mean, Smith is, if anything, I suppose, an 18th century radical, and a early classical liberal, but that does not mean that he's a progressive, because he certainly isn't. Let me go on to another one, which I see very, very often, and that's the claim that Smith believed in antitrust law. And that is, people get that one. And this one, I should say, I was sort of irritated because I saw this claim made by somebody who I had once known, who was an economist and quite a smart economist, Jennifer Roback, only now she's Jennifer Roback Morse. And what I remember about Jenny Roback is that when the VPI considered hiring her, Jim Buchanan's comment was, "This is one we would want even if her name was John." So she was in fact quite bright, but she picked up, I thought I had, just looking, because I thought I had somewhere in here what she said, which I am, well, maybe I do, just a minute here. Oh no, this is another one, I'm sorry. This was somebody else, and this person said, quoted correctly, I should say, though not completely, land ownership privileges are founded on the most absurd of all suppositions, the supposition that every successive generation of men has not an equal right to the earth, but that the property of the present generation should be regulated according to the fancy of those who died 500 years ago. Note that the quote does not include land ownership privileges. That's the interpretation of the person who was quoting it. What is Smith actually talking about? He's not talking about the ownership of land. He is talking about entail, the rule under which one owner could then restrict forever what happened to the land later. In particular, could insist that it only be inherited together by the elder son. So what he says, this is what comes just before this quote: when great landed estates were a sort of principalities, entails might not be unreasonable. Like what are called the fundamental laws of some monarchies, they might frequently hinder the security of thousands from being endangered by the caprice or extravagance of one man. But in the present state of Europe, when small as well as great estates derive their security from the laws of their country, nothing can be more completely absurd. So he is not, in fact, arguing against ownership of land. This should be pretty obvious if you read Smith. He's arguing against entail, and he's thus, in fact, arguing for greater land ownership privileges, namely that the current landowner owner should have the privilege of dividing the land among their heirs, which is what entail basically prevents. Public schooling. Public schooling is another very, very common assertion that one sees, that people claim that Smith was in favor of public schooling. And in that case, what's actually going on is that Smith has a very long discussion of the subject in which he gives arguments both for and against government involvement in schooling. So the one that people often quote correctly is, for a very small expense, the public can facilitate, can encourage, and can even impose upon almost the whole body of the people the necessity of acquiring those most essential parts of education. And that sounds as though he's arguing for public schooling, and at that point he is, but he has arguments on the other side. And note that what he is proposing there is not what we are used to seeing as public schooling. The public can facilitate this acquisition by establishing in every parish or district a little school where children may be taught for a reward so moderate that even a common laborer may afford it, the master being partly but not wholly paid by the public, because if he was wholly or even principally paid by it, he would soon learn to neglect his business. So he is in fact arguing for a subsidized private school system in which a minority of the salary of the teachers is being paid by the state. But he also says those parts of education is to be observed for the teaching of which there are no public institutions are generally the best taught. And there are various other things which touch on this in various ways. So if you actually look at what Smith's argument is, you can certainly honestly quote passages that sound as though he's in favor of some public involvement. But if you read the whole, if you read all of the long section on education, you discover that at the end of it, he has a summary conclusion. And his summary conclusion is, the expense of the institutions for education and religious instructions is likewise, no doubt, beneficial to the whole society. And they therefore, without injustice, be defrayed by the general contribution of the whole society. This expense, however, might perhaps with equal propriety and even with some advantage be defrayed altogether by those who receive the immediate benefit of such education and instruction, or by the voluntary contribution of those who think they have occasion for either the one or the other. So his final conclusion is that some subsidy by the government would not be unjust, but it might be more prudent to leave education entirely private. Sorry, for some reason, what I have on my pages is not quite the same. I think the order came out the wrong way. That's right. That's what happened. All right. So let me now get to why I was irritated at Jenny Roback, because she wrote the following in a different context. She wasn't really writing about Smith. Adam Smith recognized in the 10th chapter of The Wealth of Nations that, quote, people of the same trade seldom meet together even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. That's true. Smith does write that. Smith understood that the natural tendency to cheat the public must be checked by legal and social norms. The law must prohibit some economic behavior, which is what she's going to be arguing for, which is why she's quoting Smith. I should say, people very, with or without that final addition, people routinely do quote this passage, stopping where she stops, in order to claim that Smith was in favor of some version of antitrust. But in fact, what Smith wrote is same thing. It is impossible indeed to prevent such meetings by any law which either could be executed or would be consistent with liberty and justice. But though the law cannot hinder people of the same trade from sometimes assembling together, it ought to do nothing to facilitate such assemblies, much less to render them necessary. A regulation which obliges all those of the same trade in a particular town to enter their names and places of abode in a public register facilitates such assemblies. It connects individuals who might never otherwise be known to one another and gives every man of the trade a direction where to find every other man of it. Or in other words, what he's arguing is not that the government should engage in antitrust, but that the government should not do things that encourage cartelization. He's essentially arguing against the 18th century equivalent of the Interstate Commerce Commission and the Civil Aeronautics Board, which respectively cartelized the railroads and trucking and the airlines in an earlier version. So that's another one which very, very commonly people get wrong. All right, let me go on. The next one, I don't actually have a quote, so I'll have to just tell you about it. And that is that Rothbard, who very much dislikes Smith for reasons I'm not sure of, asserts that the evidence that Smith is not really a free trader is that he proposed an export tax on wool. What Rothbard does not mention is that at the time it was illegal to export wool. There was this crazy theory that English wool was special, and if the foreigners couldn't get English wool, they couldn't make good cloth, and that would give the English an advantage. So it was illegal to export it. That law was enforced by ferocious penalties on things like transporting wool near the coast and so forth, because they were worried about smuggling. So I'll get to that in a minute. So one of the things I've criticized Rothbard for before is that it seems to me that telling someone he's in favor of an export tax without mentioning that this is a substitute for an export ban is not entirely an honest account. But the other, and maybe worse, I'm not sure, bit of Rothbard's account of Smith is that Rothbard claims that Smith was in favor of public schooling, which, as I say, is not really true, though it's an understandable mistake if you don't read him very carefully. He claims that it's in order to make people more obedient to the state, which is a probably not understandable mistake. I discussed that in something I wrote. But the really interesting thing is that Rothbard is very strong on Turgot, who is a French economist who Rothbard thinks is greatly superior to Smith. He does not mention that Turgot, as a government minister of France, wrote a letter to the King of France, the first and most important of all the institutions which I believe to be necessary, the one most fit to immortalize your majesty's reign, to have the most influence over the whole extent of the kingdom is, sire, the formation of a Council of National Education, under whose direction we place the academies, the universities, the colleges, and all the smaller schools. So Turgot, Smith is saying we ought to consider the possibility of some modest government subsidy to education, Smith being an academic. Turgot, as a government minister, is urging the king to nationalize the entire French education system. Furthermore, it would be the duty of one of the councils to get composed a series of classic books according to a regular plan, so that one would lead on to another, and that the study of the duties of the citizen, member of a family and of the state, might be the foundation of all other studies, which would be graduated in the order of utility they have for the state. So he was also proposing nationalizing the textbook industry. But he also tells you why. I can propose nothing to you more advantageous for your people, more fit to maintain peace and good order, to give activity to all useful works, to make your authority to be cherished, to attach to you each day more and more the affections of your subjects, than to give to all of them an instruction which opens their mind to the obligations they have to society and to your power that protects them. The duty which these obligations impose, the self-interest that all have to fulfill these duties for the public good and for their own. So he makes it fairly clear why he wants, at least why he tells the king he wants to have the French government take over all of education. So you can't very well click on these, though. If at some point, I guess maybe the people who are seeing a streaming version can. I assume the streaming version you're showing them the screen as well, or not? Yeah, right. So the discussion of Smith is the first of those. The discussion of Rothbard is the second, and both of those are part of my current writing project, which is taking 14 years of blog posts and converting the ideas into one or more books. And the link down there is to the drafts of the first 4 sections and the beginning of the 5th section of those books, which are on my webpage. So that's really what I have to say. It is not as long as some of my talks, but I thought it was sort of interesting to defend Smith and to point out the various ways in which he gets misrepresented. Thank you. Contemporary with Smith. He's a contemporary with Smith.
Thank you very much indeed, David, for an absolutely excellent rebuttal of some of the more common misconceptions about Smith. Hopefully the person I mentioned in my intro on Twitter was watching along perhaps on the live stream, or in fact is this night, who knows?
Yes.
So I think he was from America, so most likely not. But
well, I'm from America.
Smith, we happen to have a wonderful bottle of the Adam Smith Institute's very own whiskey vintage, Spirit of the Invisible Hand.
I see.
And for those who are unaware, it's not recommended for socialist, statist bureaucrats and mercantilists. And that's the best part of the label, designed by wonderful Max over there. You'll be led to promote an end that was no part of your intentions.
Right.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you. Very nice.
Now, if it's okay with you, David, we've got some time for some formal Q&A,
Sure.
and then we can perhaps continue the conversation more informally
Mhm.
as well. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand and we'll take them one by one.
Yeah.
Hi. So if you have a spare hour in your day, a marginal hour, you could spend your time arguing for what you believe in from first principles. So I'm really interested why you think it's more important to spend that marginal hour defending what Adam Smith originally said, rather than really good, crisp, first principle arguments for new generations about free market economics.
I believe in doing many different things. You can find my arguments for economics in price theory and hidden order. You can find my arguments for the free market and indeed an extreme free market in Machinery of Freedom. I have given, this is the 8th talk I have given in the last 2 weeks, the last one. They were all on different topics, but it seemed to me that people at the Adam Smith Institute might be interested in hearing about the misrepresentations of Mr. Smith. And since I happen to have a chapter on that subject, I decided it would be a good subject for this. But if you would like to get other things, there are on YouTube, you can find most of the talks I've given on quite a wide variety of subjects, including why market failure is more of an argument for laissez-faire than against it, and why there are serious problems with the use of externality arguments in contexts like population or climate change, and including how a society with private property and rights enforcement without a government might work. But I do not see that that is a good reason not to give talks on other subjects of interest. I even gave a talk in Prague on science fiction and fantasy and libertarianism, or about 3/4 of a talk because I mistimed it.
Please feel free to continue the Q&A. I'm just going to crack open the window because I'm conscious that I may not be the only person feeling a little warmer.
Yes.
Yes. Oh, isn't the terrible truth that Adam Smith did come out with some notion about the Labour theory of value?
As I say, yes, three different.
Disreputable fellow Karl Marx had the same idea. I mean, isn't that it's very embarrassing to? Isn't that's true? Isn't it?
When you say the labor theory of value, Smith, if I remember correctly, and it's a while since I taught history of thought, had, I believe, 3 different labor theories of value. One of them was the idea that in a primitive society where the only input was labor, goods would exchange at a rate corresponding to the amount of labor that went into them. But that would no longer be true in a more developed society where there are other inputs. Another one was that essentially the right price index, though he didn't put it that way, was to ask how many hours of labor it took in order to buy something. And that if you observed that over time it took fewer hours of labor to buy things than it had in the past, in that sense, the society would be getting richer. And I think there was a third one, but I don't think I remember what it was. Now, Smith does have a version of the iron law of wages, although Ricardo has a much more sophisticated version of the same thing. And Malthus has it as well. That is the idea that you tend to get equilibrium wages that maintain the population, because if wages are higher, I think all three of them had the idea that birth rate would be an increasing function of wages, that the richer people were, the more they would be able to afford to produce and rear children. That one implication of that was that if wages were substantially above the level at which each family just reproduced itself, then the working population would increase, and that would tend to push wages down. Now, Ricardo, who is a much better economic theorist than Smith, I should say, Ricardo starts his book by saying, I'm a great admirer of Adam Smith. Everything where I don't say I disagree with him, you can assume I agree with him, and then explains why Smith's price theory is impossible, why it leads to internal contradictions. But Ricardo's version notes that what the natural wage is will itself depend on the tastes of the workers. That is, on how well workers have to live before they're willing to make the sacrifice of rearing children. And so the wonderful line in Ricardo is that the friends of mankind must wish that the workers should have luxurious tastes, because if so, the equilibrium wage will be higher. Another question? Yes, somebody in back.
This might be blasphemy here, but is there a danger of holding Adam Smith up as a perfect example when he was the first economist and not the last economist?
Well, he wasn't the first economist, and he wasn't a very good economist. He was a very good writer. He knew an enormous amount, but he did not really have a consistent, thought out, internally consistent economic theory. That's what Ricardo does. Ricardo is really, I would have said, the first really competent economic theorist. But nonetheless, Smith says lots of interesting things, many of which are correct, some of which are quite ingenious. And I think he's an admirable person and an admirable writer. But I'm not sure I know anybody who only says things I agree with. It would not be very interesting, I don't think. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, you.
But leaving aside comparative advantage, Adam Smith was an optimist. He was a person who looked towards free trade. What the hell happened to Scottish?
To Scottish what?
What happened to the Scottish?
Well, that was a little while ago.
Yes.
Things do change over time, unfortunately. There were a bunch of very important, that is, Smith and Hume were the obvious very important. Hume had inflation right. But now Ricardo was not Scottish. He wasn't really a very close relative of mine because he was Sephardic and I'm Ashkenazi, but at least related more distantly. Yes.
Jordan Peterson writes a lot about inequalities and hierarchy. How it's endemic not just in human society, but in all aspects of life on Earth. And in particular, he makes the comment that where Marxism gets it wrong is that it always portrays those with wealth as the oppressors and those without it as the oppressed. What do you think Adam Smith had to say about that?
I think Smith thought that merchants and manufacturers tended to try to use the government in order to get advantages they were not entitled to. Smith, as I read it, Smith is trying to persuade the landowning gentry, who are the major political power, that the policies that he believes are good for the general population are also in their interest. And I think he sometimes shades his argument a little in doing that. But there's no implication that he disapproves of them. And as that one quote I gave you about the wealth accumulated by many years or many generations, I think it's clear that he thinks that wealth has functions. Yes.
When certain political groups try and co-opt Smith to their ends, I often think of his views on free banking, for example, defending the Scottish system even after it was quite discredited in 1722. His statements about how he sort of marveled at the common law system in England in terms of competition for arbitrating cases. Is there anything else that Smith wrote then that is sort of lesser known that would appeal to those
that is
radical?
Smith was in favor of private money issue of the Scottish system, which I think is a position I agree with. He thought there ought to be laws limiting the production of small bills, and I think that's not a correct position in my view. And he also thought that there should be usury laws, although at a fairly high level. And I think he had not correctly thought through the difference between the nominal interest rate and the risk-adjusted interest rate, and therefore was afraid that if you didn't have usury laws, people who were engaged in risky investment or spendthrifts would in effect absorb too much of the capital because they could outbid the people who just wanted to use the money to produce things. And I think that's not a correct position, because lenders will say to themselves, how sure am I that this person will pay me back, and adjust the interest rate they charge accordingly. So no, I think Smith made a number of mistakes, but then I've probably made a mistake or two myself, although I certainly hope not. It's even possible you have. Other people?
I was wondering if you could explain why he was against small bills.
I don't think I can reproduce his argument well enough. There's a metaphor, as I remember, to the risk of fire spreading somehow. And I think it partly has to do with the idea that the people using small amounts of money are not being very careful, or not paying attention to whether the banks are really solvent and so forth. But to give a decent answer to that question, I have to go back and reread the passage, and I have not done so for a long time. If you're sufficiently curious, by the way, if you go on my webpage and you search through the academic part of it, I do have outlines from when I was teaching history of thought, which included Smith. I mainly covered Smith, Ricardo, and Marshall. I think they're the three most important figures, really. Although there were a couple of other people who, I taught it a number of times at different universities, so there were a few other people I also counted, but I think those are the main ones. And Marshall is the one who I think basically gets things right, although I'm not sure Ricardo makes any mistakes, but there's a lot he doesn't know yet.
I think on that note, we've got one more perhaps.
Yeah.
I have two questions, a very serious one and one I want to find a note. You are the closest we can get to your father, whom we all respected, and some of us sat at his feet at the RDA. Is it possible for you to tell us what his concerns were at the end of his life for the future? And the lighter question is that in 1974, 48 years ago, when some of us were younger and had bushier hair, we heard you speak, and you also entertained us to a recitation of the Iliad.
Not of the Iliad. I could have recited something there. I know quite a lot of poetry, but I do not, in fact, know either the Iliad or the Odyssey. Yes, yes.
But you were in.
I understand.
Learning something
Yes.
very long.
But to begin with, I don't know what all of my father's concerns were, but I know that his last concern, in some sense, was with education, because the last major thing my parents did was to establish a foundation for the purpose of promoting vouchers in order to create a competitive market for education. But I can offer you Kipling's anarchist poem, which I don't know how many of you realize that Kipling wrote an anarchist poem. Indeed, Kipling wrote 2 science fiction stories. And in one of them, this is a song that the people are singing, and it's sort of seen as dangerous. Whether the state can loose and bind in heaven as well as on earth, if it is better to kill mankind before or after the birth, these are matters of great concern where state-kept schoolmen are. But holy state, we have lived to learn, endeth in holy war. Whether the people are led by the Lord or lured by the loudest throat, if it be quicker to die by the sword or cheaper to die by vote, These are things we have dealt with once, and they will not rise from their grave. For holy people, however it runs, endeth in holy slave. Whatsoever for any cause seeketh to take or give power above and beyond the laws, suffer it not to live. Holy king or holy state or holy people's will, have no truck with the senseless thing, order the guns and kill. Saying after me, once there was the people, terror gave it birth. Once there was the people, and it made a hell of earth. Earth arose and crushed it. Listen, O ye slain. Once there was the people, it shall never be again.
Very glad we did take that last question. I'd like to join us downstairs to continue the conversation. And we've got some left. I know there's some more wine and merriment. Thank you all very much for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.